Hey, Vass.
Hey.
We will hear about you this podcast, I hope. What about your inner artist? Are we going to get that? Like, what kind of art are you into? Does it include computer-generated art? Like, where are you at on this stuff?
You know, it does not include AI-generated art. There is a Canadian artist that I'm quite fond of called Jack Bishop, who does commentary on kind of group of seven work. He does these landscapes of kind of suburbia. So, you know, he says that's our kind of modern day group of seven work. And
people should check out, but not everyone on the podcast will know Group of Seven, right? Like that is a Canadian gem.
That's right.
And so
that's a Canadian gem.
Should check it. There's a lot of it online. It is really cool
And
stuff.
I also, I live with a very small artist, right? So on Sundays, we go to this wonderful drop-in art space for kids for an hour from 10 to 11. And you know, we engage together on mixed media and clay and goop, and I'm really good at procuring from the dollar store. If you really want a tip or hot tip, Paul, is these things called paint sticks that you can get at the dollar store. It dries right away. This is the future. The future is now. But what about you? And CG has gorgeous art all over. So at the workplace, it's quite nice. But what kind of art are you?
What am I into? I mean, I've always been a lousy artist. So I look at other stuff. And I've always been fascinated by paintings, like particularly portraits. There's something about those kind of faces in history that are looking at you with a brave face or sad or scared.
Yeah.
And it's kind of
confronting
the moment in time, you know, has been captured. Often historically, right? There's like an historical moment or an age or something. And you know, you kind of makes you think about, are they capturing, did they put the face on they wanted on that artist, or was it kind of what that emotion was at that time? And a lot of the time it was, of course, just the artist's view and their eye. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But one time when I was looking at this stuff, I was thinking, you know, in the kind of earlier digital age, like say 20 years ago or something, it's like, where does this go? Is it going to be as good replicated digitally as the real thing, right? And it's not really about portraits per se, but it just made me think of like, could you produce something digitally that somebody could say that's as real as the real thing over there, because they're indistinguishable somehow.
Or even when you look at a portrait or like, you know, a candid, you must have family photos that are, you know, in a physical album, and you sort of glimpse back at yourself and, you know, the way we were. And that feels a little bit different than, you know, looking at an image on your cell phone or on your computer that you've taken.
Got lots of those. They were a little bit blurry sometimes. I couldn't tell whether that was the parent's hand, kind of like, you know, because they had a beer in the other hand, or because the cameras weren't as good. But yeah, I've got a lot of those. Well,
today we're going to speak with an artist and a thinker who is going to help us think through this crossover and interplay between digital and capital A art. We're speaking with Amanda Wasielewski. Amanda's an associate senior lecturer of digital humanities and an associate professor. She's also a docent of art history in the Department of Archives, Libraries, and Museums at Uppsala University in Sweden, and her artwork has been exhibited internationally. Her most recent monograph is Computational Formalism, Art History and Machine Learning from MIT Press.
I love that title, and the cover, it really got me when I saw it, of just kind of like, oh yeah, like you just see this screen kind of scanning a face right on the cover.
In our conversation, we're going to be exploring the artificial separations between arts and science and how that extends to tensions and conflict between art historians and computer scientists who can learn a lot from each other and who often are.
That's great, Vass. So welcome to Policy Prompt, Amanda. Delighted to have you today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Amanda, it's great to meet you today. Your background is very interesting. You've worked and studied in a few different countries. How has that journey influenced where you are now? Can you give us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've never really fallen very naturally or neatly into a kind of academic field box. I started out my sort of academic career studying chemistry, actually, as an undergraduate, and decided I kind of wanted to deal with bigger questions in the realm of art. So I ended up kind of completely switching directions and going to art, but I still maintained a really strong interest in technology and science. I worked for a while as a kind of web developer. So I had a kind of really mixed background, and it made some of my interests a little bit eclectic and unusual for the field of art history, which is the field in which I got my PhD. But, ultimately, I think, it's really good when you're dealing with these sort of cross-disciplinary topics to kind of meet in the middle or try to sort of have some understanding of both sides of the equation. And so, yeah, I think ultimately that kind of interdisciplinary background has really benefited me, have a kind of different perspective, but it's not always easy in the sort of academic realm to when you don't very neatly fit into a particular field.
Would you say that computational formalism is unusual, or that it doesn't quite fit anywhere? Because of course I have to ask you how you kind of break that down.
Yeah, so I mean, you mean the book or the term?
The book and the term. I think I meant to anchor in the term.
Yeah, so I think that the book is actually quite grounded in art historical theory and the sort of history of formalism, or this term formalism, which is very art historical, and it's about the kind of science of forms, or the how we deal with and how we look at forms. But the whole book is actually about computer science. So it's looking at computer science research from this art historical perspective, and hopefully, I guess, trying to sort of meet halfway in the middle on that, to sort of introduce maybe some of these ideas from art history into computer science, or at least, open up that possibility. But likewise, to kind of open up a better understanding of what's happening in computer science for art history as well. And in a broader sense, kind of looking at what effect this has in the broader computer vision landscape, because art is only one small kind of data set of all of the images that are treated or analyzed or used in computer vision research. I was at a computer vision conference about a month ago with all computer vision researchers, and it was quite interesting because I was the kind of lone humanist there to talk to all these computer vision researchers, and often is the case, they deal with all kinds of different domains. They're dealing with whatever might have visual information, be that medical imagery or entomology or stuff from, other sciences or art, other kinds of visual culture items.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about video processing applications. Video is a type of data, type of format that we have every day on our smartphones, on our TVs, and it's unstructured type of data, which contains a lot of information.
And I, my talk had a nice debate at the end of it, and one of the researchers there said, Amanda, I have to tell you that in computer vision research, most of the researchers don't care about the kind of data that they're using. They want to kind of, get their work done that they want to get done, and they don't have time to sort of become domain experts. Some people kind of catch the bug, and get really interested in the topic that they're researching, but oftentimes they don't. And I said, yeah, I understand that. I totally understand that. That's not the sort of point of the research a lot of the time, but I'm interested in it. So I think, it's interesting to kind of bring this up in this context, because if I, as an art historian, this is my domain knowledge, but I'm also interested in the techniques that you're developing around my kind of domain knowledge. So, so I think that there's a lot to sort of learn from each other across this sort of gulf of disciplinary divides.
So I've seen quite a few different groups interacting before. I don't think I've ever seen art historians and computer scientists in the wild kind of, interacting directly. But it feels like to me that with the way generative AI has gone in particular, that things have changed. And as you say, computer scientists use whatever's out there, and but they don't think about the origin or the categorization and kind of things that you get into in your book. And I guess one other surprise with generative AI was it was very powerful on language, but very quickly became powerful on imagery. That surprised me quite a bit, in that I didn't think there would be that fundamental generation of images. So it does feel like art history and computer science have been pushed together a lot more closely as a result of where generative AI has gone. Now, do you feel that that's starting to happen more? Like, are there more contacts and more chats happening?
Oh yeah, 100%. It's been really interesting and quite exciting, I think, in terms of like, how are we dealing with these technologies? I mean, there's a lot of, hype on both. There's a lot of negative hype. There's a lot of positive hype in the media. There's a lot of artists who are very angry about the rise of generative AI for justifiable reasons.
All you got to know is, in order for that image to be generated, there has to be a data set. And that is where the problem comes in. In these data sets, there exists billions of copyrighted images, of artworks, of photographs, of people, all of which was collected from the internet without the consent of the intellectual property owner. My personal artwork that I share on my Instagram page has been used to train AI models. And chances are...
but you look at like the major computer vision research conferences, and all of them are introducing like art elements, which I think is really fascinating. So like artists suddenly are participating, and all the major tech companies have sort of art residencies that relate to AI. So artists working with tech companies as well. And I mean, you could think about that really cynically, but I also think there's an opportunity there to sort of, broaden the kind of perspectives on these technologies beyond their, I think a lot of the commercial text-to-image platforms, their sort of intended use is quite limited. And I think there is more potential there. And I don't agree with those sort of critics who say that it just kind of is, it has to be some kind of bland, just pastiche of all kinds of stock images. That I think there is interesting potential there just to experiment with for artists, and lots of artists are. So to me, that's the kind of interesting part is sort of seeing not only artists interested, because artists are always interested in new technology. Artists have often been some of the, kind of first, early adopters of any new kind of commercial technology to integrate it into artistic practice. But to also see the researchers kind of, interested in to see how artists take that on board or what they do with it, and even kind of experiment themselves. There's a kind of, there is this sort of utopian idea that this democratizes the making of creative work. And I'm not sure I would go that far, but I think there is definitely an interest in experimenting for a wider group of people that, potentially is quite interesting.
Just a follow-up on that the when you look at what's out there on social media, I'm increasingly seeing those prompt engineers asking questions related to images, right? And kind of refining images. And so that you're starting to see it everywhere. It's often not even acknowledged that it's AI generated. It's kind of a background, so it's starting to kind of seep in across the board, right? Like just these images. And then there's these refined prompt engineers, artistic prompt engineers that are emerging. But there's a lot of division as well, right? There's some people are absolutely not wanting to engage in that space, as you say.
Well, some sort of reject any applications for what is produced, right? And sort of maybe this is like the hype or some subset of that debate with AI generated art, Paul, where it's just like, what is this really for? And maybe an artist in residency at a large technology company can kind of help us be thinking through that or experimenting. Amanda, to your mind, what do these roles or chairs or kind of, that's another area where we're kind of merging disciplines in a way. What's the potential there that you think people are missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have kind of yet to sort of really unravel what it means to train text and image into a model together. It's not the same thing as a kind of keyword search for an image. There's some kind of synthesis between two different forms that are happening in text image models and sort of given the sort of clip-based models. I think that there's really interesting potential there. And there's been a long history of, in humanistic study, text and image study. So the kind of what is the relationship between text and image? Text is not necessarily just meant to describe images. It interacts with images. It represents things. So do images. The sort of there's a semiotics angle to all of this as well. So I think artists are kind of willing to explore that and explore these kind of the weirdness of the latent space of the model, where you'll get certain kind of image fragments, image bits, image types that are trained into a certain kind of semantic area. And I think that has this sort of, it's both random and it can be kind of directed. And I think that's, a really interesting aspect for a lot of artists too. And so, I think, the sort of explainable AI field is really ascendant in computer science research, and artists, kind of maybe can help with that as well. And not in the technical side of it, but in, what does it mean to, explain what's happening in a model that otherwise might be a kind of black box that we don't really understand why or how we get out what we get out from certain models, given the input we put in. So I think that is also, potentially, and I mean, I think it's always good to have artists on board in the sense that artists are kind of free agents in a way. They don't tend to kind of, have, kind of responsibilities to any particular point of view or any particular kind of functionality. So the way that artists use tools is often kind of like the way hackers traditionally have used tools is like, I'm going to open this up and I'm going to see how it works. I'm going to see what it can do. And it's not necessarily doing the things that the people who designed it even envisioned that it would do. Like the sort of, people who would used to, sort of hack, different electronics to be instruments or things like that, different devices to do different things. And I think in a similar vein, artists, can have the potential to use these systems in that way. That's not to say that there aren't, the very real issues of, what do we think about the fact that there are proprietary data sets that use vast amounts of copyrighted material, often, from artists, and you could put their names into a prompt and get out work that looks exactly like theirs. So I don't want to like diminish the fact that that is also an issue in the generative AI arena, but I don't think that means we throw the whole thing away, that there's no potential creative output.
We're speaking with artist and academic Amanda Wasielewski about her book, Computational Formalism, Art History and Machine Learning. In it, Amanda explores how the use of machine learning to analyze art images has revived formalism in art history, presenting a golden opportunity for art historians and computer scientists to learn from one another. You can find Computational Formalism, Art History and Machine Learning at your local bookstore. Just chasing that dataset question, I read that your first book, Made in Brooklyn, Artists, Hipsters, Makers, Gentrifiers, is in the book's 3 dataset. I was curious what that's been like for you, and maybe even like, where were you when you kind of figured that out? What was that like?
I think actually my husband told me, because like as soon as that was released online, of course he went to like go, search, for my book. Honestly, I guess I'm a bit laissez-faire about that kind of stuff. Like I honestly don't care. I kind of think, it's interesting to be part of a kind of some kind of collection of big data that is supposed to represent our culture, our society in some way. That's not, again, that's not to sort of diminish the artists who are upset by the use of their work and that kind of thing. But for me, I kind of see models as these like weird little microcosms, these weird little kind of encapsulations of a certain segment of our cultural output. And so to kind of be included in that, I guess, is to be included in a little mini world that can produce new things. So that's kind of cool, I guess.
So one thing that fascinates me about thinking about computers digitizing art and the history of art is the forgery question, right? And of course, throughout history, things of value have been forged. Certainly art was key in that, and sometimes would even fool experts. Presumably there are many forgeries that still exist that haven't been detected. But often the grandmasters and others, there were usually ways to determine authenticity to a high degree of confidence by looking at, signature traits in style. Obviously, there was a forensic element to that with canvas and frames and paints and things. We're now seeing huge deep fakes of all kinds, including images. Is there something that makes forgeries very difficult to detect on AI? And how big a problem will AI be for generating forgeries?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that really fascinates me because I think, it comes down to, also questions about what we value in art, originality, authenticity being attributed to sort of a single person's work. Because, of course, a lot of the, Renaissance sort of era paintings were still, done by workshops. So, they might have a name attached to them, but there were many assistants who worked on those works. And of course, before that time, it was most art was created by teams or different people working in different capacities. For instance, medieval sort of illumination and things like that. So, this sort of idea of the singular kind of genius artist creating the singular work is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's a very Western phenomenon or a Western value. But I mean, of course, we have a very high, the art market since the 90s has just exploded, particularly older artworks, but particularly contemporary artwork as well, which there was a recent case of Damien Hirst, the contemporary artist, having backdated a lot of his more recent works. And there's a big scandal about whether, because that inflates the value of these works, of course, to have them backdated.
Hirst's acclaimed formaldehyde animal works, most of which are from the 1990s. It looks like some of them were concocted in 2017, artificially aged, if you will. And this has left many feeling uneasy. Let's break it down.
Rather than, they were made a couple years ago, not, 10, 15 years ago. But I mean, I think that this question of AI and authenticity, the companies, the startups that exist that work with using AI to detect what they say are not authentic paintings. I mean, the companies themselves have said, this is just one tool in the toolbox. You can't sort of say AI will do it. AI knows for sure whether a painting, and it's always, going to have to be sort of two-dimensional artworks. I should mention that in paintings in particular, because a lot of these techniques still use neural networks that are kind of trained to recognize sort of brush strokes or like the hand movement in the same way as like a handwriting analysis would. So sort of signature analysis and things like that. And of course, not all artworks subscribe to that, but it also, falls under the idea, which all art authentication does to a certain extent, is that artists won't ever change how their style is, enacted, that artists don't change their style, they don't change their manner of making, that they might not change the materials they use. And of course, we know that's not true. Artists change a lot over their careers. And so the idea is to sort of, okay, how much do they change, but what stays fundamentally the same in an artist's work over the course of their life? The other issue is, of course, that we got issues of data when we deal with authentication, especially automated authentication. Like most artists make very few, in computer sort of data set terms, very few artworks. So the amount of like material we have with which to sort of base an authentication conclusion is very little. You don't have millions of artworks to sort of train a neural network on. So you don't know that, you don't know how accurate actually it can be. And the other question, of course, is that many of the works we think are authentic are actually not. There's been some estimates that as many as like 20 to 40% of museum collections are either misattributed or completely falsely attributed. This is what, these are the questions that our whole kind of system of value, our kind of market value of artworks hinge around. And they're very important questions because there's a lot of money at stake. And there's also institutional prestige at stake. There's one AI, authentication startup who has gone around the media saying various artworks and various kind of, large collections, national collections are not authentic. And, they get good publicity out of that. But the museums, of course, have a big stake in, maintaining that those, prized works from their collection are, in fact, authentic. So there's a lot. I mean, the art authentication world, it has a lot of people with a lot of, kind of vested interests, personal interests that don't have anything to do with whether they care if the artwork is actually authentic or not. But I think it is interesting that, we can get at, for a certain kind of artwork, we can use neural networks to sort of get close to, or at least have an approximation if we think, maybe this work was done by the same artist. And that's pretty impressive.
It's pretty cool. It is impressive given those limitations. When a startup is trying to shake up the art world by proclaiming that museum collections are partially falsified or misleading, what are they really pointing at? Because an institution wouldn't sort of knowingly show art that they didn't think was what it was. Like, what are we really talking about in the art world by wanting to pursue this type of verification?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that institutions, once a work has become known and become a draw to their collection, might have an interest. Like if someone came out tomorrow and said, the Mona Lisa is not a Da Vinci painting, would the Louvre keep showing that painting? Yes, probably a lot of, and they would probably say, of course it is. But I mean, there was the famous case, which is still sort of unresolved, of the the painting of Christ, which is said to be of Da Vinci, but then said not to be by various experts. And there was a plan actually to hang that next to the Mona Lisa at an exhibition at the Louvre, and that didn't actually happen. And then the painting kind of disappeared again. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of politics involved in the authentication business, and obviously a lot of money, which complicates things. It's not just a kind of pursuit of truth. And this is true of art historians as well. There are certain art historians who have made a good deal of money and based their kind of personal reputation on the fact that they said, this particular work, I know, I'm an expert, I have the expert eye. I know that this work is authentic, and they, that's their professional reputation, and often that's also their kind of paychecks, extra paychecks on the line. So yeah, there's lots of politics involved, and I think entering into that space is also, again, it's one of these questions of computer scientists kind of going into a fraught domain that they maybe aren't even fully aware of, how fraught that domain is. They just think, oh, hey, I can use this, maybe start a business on art authentication. And then they enter this whole kind of Wild West world of art authentication, which is, the material specialists who are also natural scientists, like chemical testing of materials and radiography and stuff like that. And the art historians who, claim to have their, expert eye, the institutions themselves, and then, add to that AI, then you've got a whole lot of different stakeholders saying different things with different motivations in terms of, what artwork might or might not be authentic.
With art, right? Both in the art itself and the institutions, I think they've underestimated how they, the inertia and things as you described. One fundamental issue that nags me a little bit, and you touched on it, is that if you're going to digitize art, so if you're going to take the art and try to put it into a large language model, you've got to digitize it. we all know that, digital representation is not the same thing as the real thing, right? Like we see with maps, a map is not the same thing as the terrain that you're walking on. There can be differences. But you've got to do that to get it into a digital form. How do we, how realistic is the digital representation, right? Like a lot of art, if you think of classic paintings or, as you mentioned, 3D art that is obviously not captured. Often art has been designed, say paintings, to reflect certain colors depending on the brightness of the external light and all of these subtle details. So all of that is washed away in a digital version, right? So we're not actually talking about very representative art in many cases, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of my one of my key points that I keep harping on about to everyone who will listen. And humanists get it usually, obviously. I think this is something that our art historians in particular like to talk about is what does it matter? How does the materiality change? How does the form of representation change depending on what medium, you're kind of translating it to. There was, this famous paper that was released by computer scientists at NVIDIA, which was proposed a technique called StyleGAN, which was replicated on the website thispersondoesnotexist.com, which went viral, where every time you refresh the page, you would get a new portrait. So that the original paper that sort of proposed that technique for StyleGAN, they say in the paper, and this is me being a weird humanist reading computer science papers for like the pros, like how are they describing what they're doing, which is not what concerns them. They're all skipping to the methods section. But they say, we used a data set of human faces. And I, keep bringing this up saying, well, no, you didn't use a data set of human faces. You used a data set of digital photographs of human faces. And it matters that they're photographs and it matters that they're digital. And people are just kind of, rolling their eyes at me because, for them, it doesn't matter. But this is the same with artworks. I mean, it really, what you can represent as a 2D, digital image is very limited. And far more limited than what, art historians would want to discuss when it comes to an artwork. You don't have the scale, you don't have the texture, you don't have the materials. You lose some, aspect of detail, perhaps. You have a kind of, what you're doing when you're analyzing, art, digital, databases of digitized artworks is you're analyzing digital images first and foremost, not artworks. And so, that's not to say, though, I mean, art historians have always used different kinds of representations as long as they've existed, photographs, slides, to analyze artworks and to sort of compare and understand artworks. It's not to say you can't get information from these sort of representations, but I think that to not acknowledge them, as you said, Paul, is kind of, it ignores the fact that there are substantial changes and there's also stuff that you just can't encapsulate. And this is the problem with, the whole art and computer vision world has a huge problem with, a lot of art after 1960 just cannot be analyzed through these methods because the methods rely on an artwork being kind of contained as a two-dimensional image. And so the question is, what's the use of these techniques if they're only for, say, a certain, couple centuries of Western art, they're only applicable to this very slim idea of what constitutes art. And what other, I've had these sort of conversations with computer vision researchers saying, okay, well, what can we do then? What would be a better representation of art? How can we make data sets or how can we construct data or analyze data that would encapsulate all these factors? And I think it's interesting. And I'm really glad people have that open mind to be like, okay, if this isn't adequate, then, what would be? And I think it's a very complex question. So yeah, I don't think anyone's satisfactorily found an answer, but at least people are thinking about it.
Policy Prompt is produced by the Center for International Governance Innovation. CG is a nonpartisan think tank based in Waterloo, Canada. With an international network of fellows, experts, and contributors, CG tackles the governance challenges and opportunities of data and digital technologies, including AI, and their impact on the economy, security, democracy, and ultimately, our societies. Learn more at cgonline.org.
Hey, Vass, are you going to be hanging digital representations of art on your walls anytime soon, where you have like a digital, painting on your wall? Is that going to cut it for you?
No, I have like a digital photo frame that changes like every 5 minutes, but those are photos I've put. They are 2D photos, but it's kind of in my place. Yeah, would I purchase a piece of digital art in the future? No, that would make me feel like I fell for some kind of scam. To be honest, I'm like, I don't have the comfort.
You're not going to buy an NFT or
yeah, I'd be like, oh my God, I guess no one can ever come over again. But I mean, Amanda, you spent a decade working as a practicing artist before shifting to academic work. And I don't mean to present those roles as being mutually exclusive or that you totally left it behind, because we sort of opened with your chemistry roots, and kind of feeling less traditional or kind of non-traditional. And I was curious. I mean, Paul, I didn't ask you back how much digital art you have. I'm sorry about that. That's kind of rude.
Yeah, it's not rude at all. But I wouldn't put up an original painting of some kind as a digital representation. Would I potentially put up some kind of NFT that was created, using current technologies? Maybe, right? But like the idea that I would take something that was drawn by hand, turn it into a digital form, and put it on the wall, I don't see that happening.
Like print out a JPEG of the Mona Lisa and hang it on above your desk.
I don't know. Isn't that any art people bought at IKEA and like undergrad or something like this? Like at the same time, it's
also like museums sell posters, right? They sell posters all the time.
True.
And like, it's a way to, that is like a way to appreciate art or have something. But, now in terms of what I would source with my very meager and modest art budget. But I want to come back to Amanda and her art, her work as an artist. I wondered, of course, those professions, those pursuits are by no means mutually exclusive, but I do imagine your rooting as an artist has informed your research and perspectives already. I can sort of hear that coming through, right? When you're like, no, this is what the data set means. Can you tell us more about what it's like to have that reinforcing experience, but also, sort of be engaged in both worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, there are certain academic fields where it's sort of like not only okay, but like normal to both be a practitioner and a researcher, like musicology, where, most people who enter that sort of academic field of academic research also have some experience, making music or playing instruments or singing or doing music as a practice in some way. Whereas, while there are plenty of art historians who might have an art practice background, I would say by and large, it's not sort of accepted that people studying art history have a practice background. And so that kind of, the idea of artistic research has ascended over since the time I did a PhD. And, I'm sort of intrigued by that idea as well, because, on one side, it's a continuation of something that existed kind of in the wild, artists doing research. And my own work was very much research based, but it also, was sort of more open-ended. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, apart from the sort of strictness of academic, life and how you're supposed to conduct academic research there. I think that, I guess I'm an advocate for the methods of artistic research that open it up to something a little bit beyond that, to infuse a little bit of creative practice in there. And I think I'm still sort of trying to integrate as much as I can into my academic work. And I think also it helps to have a sensitivity to like, what are artists' motivations? How do artists work? I think there's a tendency, especially with fine art, to attribute intentionality to everything, the sort of genius myth of like artists always know exactly what they're doing. They're always gonna, execute the plan that they had in their mind from the beginning. There's like no accidents. There's no kind of ulterior motives. It's all just perfectly planned out and beautiful and genius. And I know that's not the case. I know that's not how artists work. So, I think there's there's both a kind of positive side and a more cynical side to sort of be a bit more realistic maybe about, what is artistic practice and how can we, I definitely 100% informs the research that I do. And also thinking about, in the computer science realm, there's a focus on method, there's a focus on practice, but that practice is towards very specific goals. And I think the potential of art within using these sort of methods is, like I said before, kind of to open it up to, beyond just the kind of narrow way that researchers might think, okay, I'm developing this technique to do X, Y, Z. But instead, artists can kind of think beyond that. How else can we use it? And I think that is one of the kind of, advantages of having an artistic background, to sort of start thinking more creatively about, how we might use these tools and what they mean.
I'm into it.
But yeah, I mean, I made digital art, so
that's why I was like, I would buy it. I don't know. So
yeah.
So thinking about digital art that is generated digital first, let's say, throughout history, the tools that artists use evolve with the times. People couldn't do intricate stone sculptures until they had the right tools to do them, right? And then that, was a huge leap forward for artists in many ways. One of the things that fascinates me is that when digital photography became the norm or the default, there's still some photography that's not digital by in the first instance. But the fact that it became digital raises a very fundamental question, and that is that when an image is taken, whether it's a photograph or a video, and it's digital, it's composed of pixels, right? Ultimately, just a number of pixels. So how can that distinguish between something that is authentically generated by you, me, or Vass versus something that's generated artificially, say by AI or by some nefarious force that's trying to fool people? They ultimately are just composed of pixels. There was no hand involved, and it's just little dots. So how is one authentic and the other not?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good questions in that. I mean, for, artists in the 20th century, many of them from, kind of surrealism through Dada and Neo-Dada, like John Cage and people like the Robert Rauschenberg, up through the present, have sort of, harnessed these different elements of chance and automaticness or automatic technologies. And I think, from sort of Marcel Duchamp onward, this idea of de-skilling in art has really taken been the ascendant concept of art, artistic practice. And so on one hand, no pun intended, the hand doesn't really matter. That kind of,
how many fingers is on the hand? No, I get it.
Yeah, I mean, so the sort of mark of the hand is no longer the kind of mark of value. And so I see no kind of conflict with what contemporary art is, using any kind of automatic means. I mean, the same debate happened around photography, up until the early 20th century. It's like, how could photography be art if it's an automatic process that's like light hitting a light sensitive surface. And no one questions now, that there is artistic quality to, taking photographs. So I think that but on the level of like, how do you tell the difference? I think that's a sort of more interesting question, because of course there's lots of people working right now on, how do we detect AI generated imagery, not necessarily for art, but for, kind of social issues related to fakes and like deep fakes and things like that, or how to detect, if copyrighted material has been used in the data set. And that's a really complex question because to a certain extent, it's going to be really hard to tell in certain instances because, like you said, if it's just the kind of on a pixel level, certainly you could say there might be artifacts there in terms of, how the image is put together. There's already visible artifacts that we can see, but, subsequent like kind of programmatic layers on top of models have made a lot of those artifacts better. So, asymmetries or, the hands problem, which, the kind of depicting of hands issue, which many people were frustrated by for the kind of early iterations of text to image generators like DALL-E. So there's like all these sort of there's different layers here, I think, to consider. And it'll be interesting to see if someone sort of comes up with, because there's lots of talk of watermarking AI generated imagery. So like, there's some kind of metadata layer as well that you could look to. But yeah, it will be interesting to see if, what people come up with in that sense, because the big fear is that once all of these AI generated images, like if they re-enter the kind of model landscape, then you get a kind of recursion where you're training new image models on AI generated images, and it becomes like what they call Habsburg AI, the famous royal family in Europe that was very inbred. So once it's inbred, the kind of genetic defects come to the surface and some researchers have argued or have shown that it will lead to some kind of model collapse. And so it just kind of breaks the system in general. So I think it's a big question in terms of practicality, but it's also a question in terms of like materiality, because I do think that like the way that AI generated images are put together is so weird and so different than how even, the sort of Photoshop paradigm. You can make all kinds of constructed images with Photoshop, but they have their own kind of artifacts and they have their own, way of being that's something different. So yeah, I think it's a super interesting question that it will be interesting to see what researchers do with that.
The questions around watermarking and labeling are really fascinating to me because on the one hand, yes, I want to be able to know as a potential consumer or as a viewer of these kinds of artifacts, kind of the terms of their production. And on the other hand, I worry or wonder if it ends up just being legitimizing for activities that, again, as you said, based on the copyright or, some debates just sort of see all of this as garbage, a form of garbage kind of proliferating all around. Yeah. I said the G word, garbage. I want to ask you, pivoting just a little bit.
The N-shitification.
N-shitification, baby. I want to ask you about something else you said. Now, this is pulled from social media, so my apologies as like a researcher here, because we're rooting in your academic work as well. But you sort of, it was very interesting to me. It's like a little bit exasperated, but I think you really had something to say. So the mainstream discourse on AI art and images really drives home how little even well-meaning and smart people know about art history. I saw myself in that. I'm like, oh my God, I'm part of this. We've had over a century of appropriation as art. So this worry about unoriginality or automation aren't the core issue. The issue has always been corporate use of personal data. I feel like I'm in that category decidedly, and no shame there, just being a little bit basic about art history. How can we improve our own kind of appreciation of art history so we can better participate in these bigger debates about images and art and construction?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, how, because there remains a disconnect between the sort of, the kind of what is contemporary art versus what the average person on the street is familiar with in terms of, and I don't want to diminish the kind of, the people who are illustrators or commercial photographers who will maybe feel that their livelihoods are directly threatened and or compromised or their copyrighted material is used. I was talking to someone who heads an organization for artists here in Sweden, and she was saying, yeah, absolutely what you said. My artists don't care. They don't care about AI. They don't worry they're going to be replaced because they're contemporary artists, and this is not a threat to what contemporary art is. That doesn't mean it's not a threat, though, to people who are making stock photographs. It's 100% a threat to them. So I think like I would like to see the sort of conversation shifted a little bit, because I think it's really interesting that, for instance, I don't know if this was a presence in Canada at all, but there was this famous commercial that would air before movies or before DVDs in like the mid-zeros, and it was like,
you wouldn't steal a handbag. You wouldn't steal a car.
Comparing file sharing basically to all of these kind of sort of what most people thought were, it became a meme because it was so ridiculous.
You wouldn't steal a baby.
They were comparing file sharing or, downloading movies illegally to stealing a car, robbing a woman of her handbag, breaking into someone's house. And it was kind of this commercial. It was like, you wouldn't steal a car.
We're all under arrest. We're all under arrest.
So I think it's interesting because looking back to that time, of course, the kind of the righteous activist part of society was very much like, no, file sharing isn't equivalent to theft. And I think likewise, the use of data isn't equivalent to like theft on the street. It's not going into a gallery and taking a bunch of pictures off the wall. That doesn't mean it isn't copyright infringement, but we could have a whole conversation about how do we enforce copyright? And I just think it's really interesting that in the mid-zeros, there was the whole copyleft movement. There was the, Creative Commons. There's all kinds of things that were, trying to push away from this copyright restricted culture landscape. And now it's coming from, what you might call the sort of progressive side of things that's pushing for more copyright restrictions. And why is that? Well, because, the people gobbling up all of this, it's not, teenagers in their bedrooms downloading movies. It's corporations, saying, okay, we got all this data, we're using it. We don't care, we don't care what you think about it. And so it's a really like, the sort of, the stakes have changed. Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? But the fact of it that underpins both of these scenarios is still that we don't know how to value digital materials. We don't know the value of a digital file. We can't with good faith think to ourselves, this is worth something. Corporations don't think so. We as consumers don't think so. So the question is, how do we deal with our cultural material that exists in digital files? Because, over, however several decades now, it's been a debate about, copyright and the ease of reproducing digital material and how we fundamentally just don't sort of, we don't value it. I mean, it's become an issue with the streaming culture as well, where artists do not receive, very much compensation for their, streams on Spotify or whatever. So I just think rather than think about it in simple terms of like, this is plagiarism, this is theft, AI systems are stealing artworks, we can think about it in terms of like, how do we value digital materials actually? How do we value cultural output that exists in digital form? The NFT bubble also was an interesting kind of, answer or interest in that area too, because it was indeed a bubble. Because ultimately, who's valuing their address on the blockchain versus, a JPEG of an ape or, I mean, for a brief moment, people were like, digital artists were all excited saying, oh, wow, people finally care about digital art. And then it all collapsed.
And then Paul bought everything.
Yeah, he's got all his NFTs hanging up.
I actually don't own any NFTs, actually, by the way. But, I might someday. So this is a good link to the changes that have literally just happened in the last year or so of just a proliferation of the ability to generate text to image generation, including now video. So the genie is out of the bottle, I think, in terms of that generation, regardless of where copyright restrictions may or may not go, there's still going to be a lot of material out there that is not subjected to copyright restrictions. So one of the core things of your work is to talk about categorization of, what it is, what these images and representations are. And that really struck me as quite fascinating, the examples where you said, look, there might be a central figure in, let's take a painting for an example, but there might be really interesting things going on in the background, or there might be an animal on the side of the painting, or a house or castle or something, and that is actually more interesting to some people that would be observing that than the central figure. And so how do you go about trying to categorize these things objectively? And I'm probably not describing it very well here, but can you tell us a little bit about that categorization challenge and how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most sort of the basic fundamental areas of computer vision research is the area of object recognition. And it proceeds kind of from the assumption that what we are interested in the visual field, looking at things, what we're interested in images, is recognizing what is depicted in that image. So, the only reason that a photograph exists is to sort of contain something. So say like, you're self-driving, and there's lots of applications, of course, self-driving cars, robotics. You want the image or the video to act as the eye of the computer system. And so it needs to sort of recognize obstacles. It needs to recognize a scene. And it's sort of, there's this sort of theory in Gestalt psychology that, without a figure and a ground, there is no vision. So you need to be able to sort of see the area of interest from whatever is the background in the image or in the world in order to sort of actually see. But the problem with this is that, there's a lot more to vision, human vision, animal vision, than there is to sort of the camera image. And so to kind of compress all of the things that, we see based on our spatial experience, we see as a combination of different senses. We see, not an image the way a camera takes an image, but we see, we don't see in that kind of way. Our brain puts together things, all these sensory experiences in a kind of synthesis. It's not a sort of, we're not just an eyeball floating through the world. And so, the problem with object recognition is that it boils down all of the complexity of vision into just this idea of, is there a cat? Is there a dog? Is there a tree? Which are fine things if that's what you're setting out to kind of do. But for, when you're looking at more complex objects, when you're thinking art objects, that's not necessarily what is the most sort of salient kind of technique to use. So, of course, there's also been attempts at categorizing so-called style, but that comes with a whole other host of problems, because when we come up with an idea of a category, the categorization automation assumes that these categories are kind of unchangeable, that they're static, that they just exist. They're kind of true, false. They're an on and off. And most things in the world that we categorize are not like that. Most things are not that simple. So, for instance, Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen did this ImageNet Roulette project that went viral, where they showed just how, the categorization of human beings can be really problematic in terms of, when it was crowdsourced, people labeled humans with all kinds of weird things because, how do you label humans? What's the most relevant way to categorize people? And, in art history, we debate all the time, how do we categorize things? Doesn't mean we don't categorize them, but there's nuances to it that I think are lost in the process of automation. So I think categorization is really fundamental here.
Speaking of nuance, your next book is out this fall, and it's called Critical Digital Art History. Can you give us just a little bit of a sneak peek or tell us a tiny bit about it?
Yeah, so it's actually an anthology. So it's there's a series of different essays in the book by different authors who are all sort of reflecting on how we can think about the use of digital tools in a more critical way. And so what I mean by critical is, not necessarily in a negative way, but in a way that kind of isn't just like, wow, here's cool stuff and here's what we can do with it, but to think through some of the issues that I've mentioned, issues of different power dynamics or issues of identity or issues of corporate stakeholders or anything like that. So, to try to open up this field to, all the toolbox of the humanities, basically, which should have been there all along. And kind of, and try to sort of think more critically, not necessarily negatively, but critically about how we use digital tools in the field of art history and looking at artworks.
So people in the policy space that might be listening to this podcast, what would their takeaway be? People that are working on, data governance issues or AI regulations and things. What is your key message to them to be thinking about?
Yeah. So, I've been involved in a lot of these sort of the debates about what's to be done in the creative sector with generative AI. And for me, my kind of top line thing is that, we need to be able to see data sets. We need to be able to open up those data sets and know what's in there. The proprietary data set is, I think, one of the biggest issues because companies like OpenAI, and I don't know how you legislate that or design policy around it, is going to be a very difficult process. But, the idea that OpenAI can sit, their representatives can sit in an interview about Sora, the text-to-video platform. There was an interview, I don't know if you guys saw it, went sort of minorly viral, where the interviewer just directly says, are there copyrighted YouTube clips?
What data was used to train Sora?
We used publicly available data and licensed data.
So videos on YouTube?
I'm actually not sure about that.
Okay. Videos from Facebook, Instagram?
If they were publicly available, publicly available to use, there might be the data, but I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not confident about it.
We just collect what's readily available online, and they have their standard lines, but they do all this with impunity because they have proprietary data sets. But the reasons, I don't know if this is the reason, but I assume the reason that the Stability AI has had so many lawsuits is because they have used an open source data set so people can see what kind of data is available there, for better or worse. And that's maybe maybe not possible, but it's at least a worthy goal to understand the data, know what's data is in there, and how it functions, and then people can know if their work is indeed there. I think on the flip side, I also would, this is my more controversial opinion, but I do think that AI generated images can have artistic value, and they're not just completely automated creations. I think there is artist or author input into them. So at the moment, I'm not a huge advocate of copyright, but if other artworks are copyrighted, why not AI generated artworks? It's a question. I'm not a copyright expert, but I'm a dabbler in copyright. But yeah, I think that, for me as a researcher, it's great that no AI generated image is under copyright because I can reproduce them in my texts without having to worry about permissions. But, on a larger scale, I do think that if copyright is the kind of mark of, okay, this counts legally as an artwork, then why not extend that to our, AI produced artworks that, artists have created.
Well, in this AI age, maybe we're all copyright dabblers at the end of the day.
I really do believe that, I guess I'm sort of getting around this, but I was talking about earlier, but somehow we went from this idea of internet culture is all about remixing and sharing and making new things and making memes, to being really against all of that. And I understand the reasons why people are against it, but I still think underneath that, this sort of idea that that nothing is really quote unquote original. We're all derivative of every work we make has influences from all over the place. No one creates anything from scratch, right? Everything has some kind of source or inspiration or influence or reacts against something. This is the history of art is all about that. So I don't know. I feel like there's this kind of we're locking down the potential of potential creativity that could come out of this era because I don't know. I'm justifiably scared, but maybe too scared of some of the, the consequences of these technologies.
Amanda, it was fantastic to meet you, and your work, I think, is central to where the debates are going around digitalization, data, AI, everything. And it's been super interesting to hear the, artistic side of this and the art history experience that you're bringing to the table. So thanks so much for your time joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting discussion. Thanks so much.
So Vass, what are your takeaways there?
I really appreciated talking to Amanda because I think she's really challenging us to think about what art is, what it can be, what it should be, how it's evolving, and how even, digitally produced images have an element of direction from a human. So those are some of the questions that I'm still noodling. What about you?
Yeah, I thought connecting computer science and art in, when the rubber hits the road was fascinating, right? Because people take a lot of these things for granted. As she said, they're just data points and let's just gather them, right? And then when you start to drill into it, you realize there's so much nuance and sophistication that will actually never be captured in digitization. So therefore, what is it? What's that bridge look like to capture more of that? But it will always be limited. I think she also touched on some of the broader questions that are out there, like open source versus non-open source, which we're going to come back to a lot, I think, on this show. So it's a great example of just kind of where the challenges lie, right? Like looking at art history and computer science was great. And I'm sure most people don't spend time thinking about these two linking, so it is really valuable.
We can all spend a little bit more time thinking about it. I also appreciated her kind of sharing with us out the gate that there was a bit of a misfit vibe to her work, feeling that it didn't quite fit neatly anywhere. It strikes me that in academia, but in many places, interdisciplinarity is the buzzword. It's something we at once aspire to, but then have trouble rewarding because of our goal of categorizing everything. And that challenge of categorization is not unlike what we see in these computational models, right? We need things to sort of fit or form a pattern. And maybe that at the end of the day just ends up being a little bit unnatural.
Yeah, because they're not totally integrated, right? As you say, interdisciplinarity, you have a joint meeting, but your title as a professor did not become art scientist from computer scientist, right? Or something like it's not actually fully integrated. So the tensions remain.
Or what conferences she goes to, right? Because she was sort of speaking what she's noticing about computer scientists. Well, is someone extending the invitation to her, or is she sort of parachuting in because of her own kind of self-declared interest and overlap?
She does seem like a bridge builder to me, in that she's open-minded and she's trying to understand, both sides, if we could call it that, or the multiple sides, and has kind of an open mind, which is not the case, right? For others would just say, hey, I don't care, I just want data, or others that say, I reject this outright. There's no way I'm working with generative AI people. So I think she's an important player in this space.
Policy Prompt is produced by me, Vass Bednar, and Paul Samson. Tim Lewis and Mel Wiersma are our technical producers. Background research is contributed by Reanne Cayenne. Brand design by Abhilasha Dewan, and creative direction from Som Tsoi. The original theme music is by Josh Snaidlaga. Sound mixing by François Goudreault. And special thanks to creative consultant Ken Ogasawara. Please subscribe and rate Policy Prompt wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay tuned for future episodes.